You know what's strange? Some of the most emotionally aware people you will ever meet are also some of the most mentally exhausted. Not because they are weak, not because they are dramatic, and not because they are incapable of handling life, but because their mind never truly stops, even during quiet moments, even during peaceful nights, even when nothing is technically wrong. Their brain keeps searching for meaning, searching for patterns, searching for hidden danger, searching for answers that may never fully arrive. And maybe you know exactly what that feels like. Maybe you replay conversations long after they end. Maybe you analyze the tone of someone's message for hours. Maybe your mind creates imaginary scenarios while you are trying to sleep. Maybe you constantly think about what you should have said or what you should have done differently. And the strange part is, you are fully aware that the thinking is exhausting, but you still cannot stop, because overthinking does not feel like a choice. It feels automatic, like your mind was trained to stay alert, and psychologically, that is often exactly what happened. Most people believe overthinking is simply anxiety, but the psychology behind it is much deeper than that. Overthinking is often a survival adaptation, a pattern your brain developed over time because somewhere in your life, staying mentally alert once felt necessary. That changes the entire conversation, because suddenly, your mind is not your enemy. Your mind is a nervous system trying to protect you, even if the protection is now hurting you. And this is where things become psychologically fascinating. Studies in cognitive psychology consistently show that chronic overthinkers tend to have unusually active internal processing systems. Their brains spend more time analyzing emotional information, predicting outcomes, and reflecting on social interactions. In simple terms, your mind notices more. You notice changes in behavior. You notice emotional shifts. You notice tension in conversations. You notice patterns other people completely ignore. And while that level of awareness can make someone emotionally intelligent and deeply perceptive, it can also become mentally exhausting, because the brain was never designed to stay in a constant state of emotional analysis. Yet for overthinkers, that internal analysis rarely turns off, even during moments that are supposed to feel calm. And sometimes the exhaustion becomes so normal that you stop recognizing how heavy it really is. You start believing this level of mental activity is simply your personality. But often, it is actually a conditioned psychological response. Think about how many overthinkers develop this pattern early in life. Maybe you grew up in an emotionally unpredictable environment. Maybe you had to constantly read people's moods. Maybe conflict appeared suddenly. Maybe mistakes felt emotionally dangerous. Maybe emotional safety depended on staying aware of everyone around you. When that happens, the brain adapts. It learns that anticipating problems feels safer than being surprised by them. So your nervous system becomes hyper-observant. You begin mentally preparing for every possibility, not because you want to suffer, but because your brain believes preparation equals safety. And years later, that same survival mechanism continues running in the background, even when the danger is gone. That is why so many overthinkers feel exhausted in situations other people find emotionally simple, because their brain is processing multiple emotional layers simultaneously. A normal conversation becomes, what did they mean by that? Did their tone change? Did I say too much? Are they upset? Should I have responded differently? And the most painful part is that overthinkers are often highly self-aware. They know the spiral is happening. They can literally watch themselves overanalyze in real time. But awareness alone does not automatically stop the pattern. Because overthinking is not purely logical, it is neurological, it is emotional, and often it is deeply connected to how safe your nervous system feels. This is why telling someone to just stop thinking about it almost never works, because the brain is not simply chasing thoughts, it is chasing certainty, and certainty feels emotionally comforting. The problem is that life rarely provides complete certainty, so the mind keeps searching again and again and again. Psychologists sometimes describe this process as maladaptive rumination, which essentially means the mind becomes trapped in repetitive thought loops. And these loops are deceptive because they feel productive. You feel like you are solving something, preparing for something, protecting yourself from something, but often the mind is simply circling the same emotional territory repeatedly, not progressing, just looping. And the frightening thing is how invisible this process becomes over time. You can spend years living inside chronic mental tension without realizing how unnatural it feels. You wake up tired, you sleep tired, you emotionally prepare for conversations before they happen. You mentally replay interactions after they end. And eventually, your brain starts treating overthinking as your default state. This is why many overthinkers struggle with true rest. Even when the body is still, the mind continues moving, constantly reviewing, constantly analyzing, constantly anticipating. And underneath all of this is usually one quiet emotional fear, the fear of getting hurt. Because psychologically, overthinking is often an attempt to emotionally protect yourself before something painful happens, if you think enough. Maybe you can avoid rejection. Maybe you can avoid embarrassment. Maybe you can avoid disappointment. Maybe you can avoid emotional pain. But here's the paradox. The very process meant to protect you emotionally often becomes the thing exhausting you emotionally. And this creates an internal conflict that many people never fully talk about. Overthinkers are often emotionally strong people. They carry enormous psychological weight internally while still functioning externally. People may see them as calm, thoughtful, intelligent, emotionally mature, without realizing how loud their mind actually is. And maybe the strangest part about all of this is that overthinkers are often deeply empathetic people. They care intensely. They feel deeply. They notice emotional nuance, which is exactly why their brain keeps searching for hidden meaning. Because emotionally aware people rarely experience the world superficially. They absorb things, and sometimes they absorb so much that their own mind becomes overwhelming. But the psychology of overthinking is not just about understanding why this happens. It is about understanding what your mind has been trying to protect you from all along. Because once you begin understanding the emotional purpose behind your overthinking, you stop seeing yourself as flawed, and you start seeing yourself more clearly, not as someone with a broken mind, but as someone whose mind learned to survive by staying awake for too long. And maybe that changes everything, because maybe your overthinking was never proof that something was wrong with you. Maybe it was proof that your mind adapted to emotional uncertainty the best way it knew how. And maybe that is why mentally exhausted people often look perfectly fine from the outside, because the battle is invisible. Nobody sees the conversations replaying in your head. Nobody sees the emotional simulations your mind keeps creating. Nobody sees how exhausting it feels to constantly search for emotional certainty in an uncertain world. They only see the version of you that keeps functioning. And over time, you become so accustomed to carrying mental tension that you forget what emotional rest even feels like. But if overthinking is connected to emotional survival, then why does the brain become addicted to thinking itself? And why does peace sometimes feel uncomfortable for people whose mind never truly stops? One of the strangest things about overthinking is that even when it hurts you, part of your brain still believes it is helping you. That is why so many people feel trapped inside their own mind, because logically, they know the overthinking is exhausting. But emotionally, stopping feels unsafe. And this is where the psychology becomes incredibly important, because overthinking is not only emotional, it is neurological, habitual, chemical. Your brain is not simply producing random thoughts. It is reinforcing thinking patterns repeatedly over time until they become automatic mental pathways. This is why chronic overthinkers often feel like their mind starts spiraling without permission. The process becomes unconscious, and one of the biggest reasons this happens involves dopamine. Most people associate dopamine with pleasure, but psychologically, dopamine is more connected to anticipation and mental engagement. Your brain releases small amounts of dopamine during activities involving searching, predicting, problem solving, or seeking answers. Which means when your mind starts analyzing situations, your brain partially rewards the process itself, even if the process is emotionally exhausting. That changes everything. Because suddenly, overthinking is not simply a bad habit, it becomes a reinforced neurological cycle. The brain starts associating analysis with emotional protection. And emotional protection feels rewarding, even when the protection itself creates suffering. This is why many overthinkers struggle to just let things go, because mentally letting go feels emotionally dangerous. The brain believes, if I stop analyzing this, I might miss something important. And psychologically, that fear creates continuous mental activity. You replay conversations, you revisit memories, you predict future outcomes, you mentally rehearse situations repeatedly. Not because you enjoy suffering, because your brain believes constant thinking increases emotional safety. And the frightening part is how invisible this process becomes. Many overthinkers believe they are simply deep thinkers, but often the mind is operating inside chronic, unresolved emotional anticipation. And over time, the nervous system becomes addicted to mental stimulation itself. That is why some overthinkers feel uncomfortable during peaceful moments. Peace feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels unnatural. Silence almost feels threatening, because the mind became accustomed to constant engagement. This is also why nighttime becomes emotionally difficult for many overthinkers. During the day, distractions exist. Conversations, responsibilities, movement, notifications. But at night, the external world becomes quieter, and suddenly the mind becomes louder. Old memories, future fears, social anxiety, regret, emotional uncertainty, and because the nervous system is no longer distracted, the brain starts searching for emotional resolution again and again and again. This is why overthinkers often lie awake replaying conversations from years ago, not because the memory still matters, but because the brain still seeks emotional closure. And closure is psychologically addictive. The mind wants certainty, understanding, emotional completion. But many emotional experiences never provide complete certainty, which means the brain keeps looping endlessly, trying to solve emotionally unresolved situations. This is why overthinkers struggle with uncertainty more intensely than most people. Ambiguity feels emotionally unsafe. Mixed signals feel overwhelming. Unclear communication feels exhausting. Unanswered questions become mentally consuming. Because the brain wants emotional clarity before it allows itself to relax. And unfortunately, life rarely provides perfect clarity. So the mind keeps searching internally. This creates a psychological illusion. The illusion that if you think hard enough, you will eventually reach emotional peace. But often the opposite happens. The more the mind searches endlessly for certainty, the more emotionally overwhelmed it becomes. And this is where many overthinkers enter what psychologists call cognitive looping, a repetitive cycle where the brain continuously revisits the same emotional territory without reaching resolution. The person feels mentally active, but emotionally, nothing actually changes. And because thinking feels productive, the loop becomes difficult to recognize. You tell yourself, I'm just trying to understand. But hours later, you are still trapped inside the same emotional spiral, and over time, this creates emotional exhaustion that spreads into every area of life. Decision-making becomes difficult. Relationships become mentally overwhelming. Rest becomes inconsistent, because the brain keeps searching for hidden problems. And one of the most painful parts about this is that overthinkers are often highly intelligent people. That intelligence becomes part of the trap, because intelligent minds are naturally skilled at generating possibilities, multiple outcomes, multiple interpretations, multiple scenarios, which means the brain can endlessly create new things to analyze. And the more emotionally aware someone is, the more exhausting the internal analysis becomes. That is why emotionally intelligent people often experience deeper mental exhaustion. They process emotional nuance constantly. Tone, behavior, subtle shifts, unspoken meaning. And eventually the brain becomes overstimulated by emotional information. This is also why overthinkers often struggle with decision paralysis, because the mind sees too many possible outcomes simultaneously. What if this works? What if it fails? What if I regret it? What if something changes later? The brain keeps expanding possibilities instead of emotionally settling into action. And psychologically, this often comes from fear. Not fear of making mistakes, fear of emotional consequences, which means thinking becomes emotional self-protection. And eventually, the nervous system becomes exhausted from constant internal monitoring. But here is something important most people never realize. Overthinking is not always conscious. Many thought loops happen automatically. The brain develops habitual pathways, and after years of repetition, the mind starts entering analysis mode instantly, without deliberate intention. This is why some people wake up already mentally exhausted. Their nervous system never fully relaxed. The brain remains psychologically active, still processing, still anticipating, still searching. And because this pattern becomes so normal, many overthinkers stop questioning it entirely. They simply assume, this is just how my brain works. But neuroscience shows something fascinating. The brain changes according to repeated mental activity, which means repeated overthinking strengthens the neural pathways connected to anxiety and mental looping. The more often the brain practices overthinking, the more automatic the process becomes. But this is not hopeless, because if the brain can strengthen unhealthy mental patterns, it can also strengthen healthier ones. But first, the person must understand what is actually happening psychologically, because healing becomes impossible when someone constantly attacks themselves for patterns they do not fully understand. Many overthinkers spend years believing they are weak, too emotional, too sensitive, when in reality, their nervous system simply became overtrained in emotional anticipation. And maybe the hardest part is that overthinking sometimes creates temporary emotional comfort. Thinking creates the feeling of doing something. Even if nothing is actually being solved, the brain feels engaged, prepared, active, and for someone uncomfortable with uncertainty, that temporary engagement feels emotionally safer than surrendering control. This is why many overthinkers struggle to emotionally rest. Rest requires trust. Trust in uncertainty. Trust in the present moment. Trust that not every outcome can be mentally controlled. And psychologically, that can feel terrifying for a nervous system conditioned around anticipation. But eventually, something important begins happening. The overthinker starts realizing that constant thinking is not actually preventing emotional pain. It is simply creating continuous emotional tension. And that realization changes everything. Because for the first time, the person begins separating awareness from safety. They begin realizing, I do not need to mentally control every possibility in order to survive emotionally. And that is a powerful psychological shift, because many overthinkers have spent years believing that hyperawareness equals protection. But healing begins when the nervous system slowly learns something different, that peace is not dangerous, that uncertainty is survivable, that rest is allowed, and maybe most importantly, that your value as a person is not measured by how successfully you predict pain before it arrives. Because eventually the mind reaches a point where endless analysis no longer feels intelligent. It simply feels exhausting. And maybe your brain was never asking for endless thinking. Maybe it was asking for safety all along. And maybe tonight, for the first time in a long time, your mind deserves rest.